5 years ago, $50,000 still sounded like the price of a luxury car. The media has a very simple explanation for this. To fund their electric dreams, Detroit is squeezing massive profits out of your gas cars. It's a story everyone understands. It has a villain, a victim, and a very expensive SUV locked in the evidence room. But this story has a fatal flaw. That narrative hinges on a flawed assumption that Detroit is still actively trying to win the EV war. They certainly made the attempt. Ford's $4.8 billion loss in 2025 is the receipt. Today, however, it's not that they don't want to win. They simply no longer have to. Detroit has essentially stopped fighting the current, allowing itself to be swept forward by a much larger, inescapable tide. The real reason your gasoline car got so incredibly expensive actually stems from a bizarre chain reaction of classic evolutionary economics. Through a long game of strategic maneuvering among all parties, the system has evolved to the point where buyers of large SUVs are now footing the entire hidden bill. It looks a lot like what happened when Netflix forced the old entertainment giants into the streaming war. Disney, Warner, and the rest of Hollywood had to spend billions building streaming platforms, buying shows, and defending their old empires from a company that had started by mailing DVDs. To fund their war against Netflix, they aggressively hiked basic cable fees, forcing elderly Americans who had never shopped online in their lives to unwittingly subsidize the premium Star Wars streaming series. The auto industry has its own version of that story. Ford drops tens of thousands on every electric vehicle sold. At the same time, Ford's commercial vehicle business, Ford Pro, was still making serious money, with an operating margin above 10%. So yes, big gasoline trucks, vans, and SUVs really were helping feed the electric future. But if you simply say Detroit made your car more expensive, it would be too unfair to Detroit. Tesla conquered Wall Street long before electric vehicles conquered Main Street. Tesla and Netflix both rule their respective kingdoms. Yet now, Tesla's operating margin barely scrapes past 4%, and Wall Street almost wrote it off as just another low-profit manufacturer. Meanwhile, Netflix has locked in an operating margin north of 30%, turning into an asset-light digital money printing press. It's got the media asking, is it time for Netflix to officially boot Tesla out of the Magnificent Seven? This highlights the fundamental difference between the automotive and streaming versions of a cash cow feeding a money pit. Old-school studio giants are burning through cable subscription fees from older viewers in a desperate bid to catch up with Netflix. After all, Tesla itself is trying to get out of the personal car business, hoping that AI and robotaxis will turn it into the next Netflix. Meanwhile, legacy Detroit is generating robust profits from gas cars, giving them zero incentive to gamble car buyers' cash on chasing Tesla. In short, Hollywood is making a deliberate bet on its new business, while Detroit is simply being pushed by the tides of the times. Let's look behind this massive wave and trace the real story of how American cars became so incredibly expensive. In 2011, a buyer could walk into a Nissan dealership and see one of the first true mass-market electric cars, the Nissan Leaf. After incentives, though, the Leaf still cost about $25,000. Across town, a Toyota Corolla could be bought for roughly $16,000. The Leaf saved gasoline, but the family still had to pay the higher price first. Under normal driving, early battery degradation could be brutal, and many owners saw their range cut by more than 40% within just 5 years. A replacement battery could cost around $15,000, almost the price of a new Corolla at the time. That mattered because outside the dealership, America was having an energy revolution of its own. In North Dakota, Texas, Pennsylvania, and the Permian Basin, the shale boom was changing the price of driving. Shale oil keeps American gas stations at half, sometimes a third, of European prices. In the United States, gasoline was often cheap enough that the early EV premium looked less like an investment and more like a beta tester fee. That is why America's electric vehicle share still sits around 10% of new car sales. In a massive bet on clean energy, Hertz famously ordered nearly 50,000 Teslas for its rental fleet. However, cheap US fuel and skyrocketing EV repair costs quickly turned the venture into a financial nightmare. Just 2 years later, the company was forced to dump half its electric fleet for traditional gas cars, a strategic blunder that ultimately cost the CEO his job. In Europe, expensive fuel makes electrification feel urgent because every trip to the pump reminds drivers that the old system is charging them in real time. Germany and France are closer to 30% EV share. Norway's EV market share has climbed to nearly 97%. But hitting this benchmark required far more than just steep gas prices and costly parking. To drive adoption, the government extended a premier perk, allowing EVs into bus lanes. Affluent commuters in West Oslo soon found that buying a Tesla not only bypassed a 25% tax, but let them cruise at 80 kilometers per hour past miles of gridlocked gas cars during rush hour. The incentive worked too well. Teslas soon choked the bus lanes, leaving public transit stranded and triggering a massive public backlash. These cold numbers do not mean oil explains everything, but they reveal that when gasoline is cheap, or when aggressive incentives dry up, EV adoption slows down. Here is the critical, counterintuitive truth. It's not that Detroit lacks a roadmap for cheap EVs, it's that America's cheap energy has turned that road into a tightrope. Bleeding too much cash, Detroit is no longer betting the house on charging through this bottleneck. They would rather creep along with the crowd and bide their time. Once a heavy hitter widens the bridge, they will make their rush. That sounds like an EV question, but it eventually becomes a car price story. Nobody seriously doubts that electric systems are part of the future, and even if someone doubts electric cars, are tomorrow's robots, drones, and automated machines supposed to run on gasoline too? If the electric transition cannot pay for itself through electric volume, the money has to come from somewhere else. And in America, that somewhere happens to be the gasoline SUV. Europe pays for it at the gas station. China paid for it indirectly through real estate. Now, let's break down the whole price hike to see how this coincidence played out, how car prices went up step by step, and who else is actually stuck with the bill. On a continent with cheap fuel, Detroit could not find an easy road from today's profitable gasoline vehicles to tomorrow's electric supply chain. Without customers, there is no scale. Without scale, there is no low price. Without low prices, there are not enough customers. That loop is very hard to break without a major push or a major accident. At the same time, China was moving at flank speed. CNBC put the cost gap bluntly, saying that the best Chinese EV startups had about a 30% cost advantage over legacy automakers even without subsidies or government help. That make Detroit's delay even more expensive. So, is Detroit completely out of options? Not at all. A path forward is finally emerging. To decipher Detroit's blueprint for a breakout, one should look to Despicable Me to see how it conquered the laws of evolutionary economics. Illumination did not have the money to fight Disney and Pixar in a full visual arms race. So the Despicable Me universe turned many expensive limitations into design choices. Hair was expensive, so many characters barely needed it. Complex bodies were expensive, so the minions became little capsules with simple shapes. Some of them did not even need two eyes. That cheap-looking compromise became one of the most profitable animation machines in the world. Detroit is pulling off a similar escape, but they aren't risking it all on a wild leap from gas to electric. Instead, they are simply letting the currents push them through a chaotic game of unexpected turns and constant battles. They are simply reacting to whatever comes their way, step by step, inching closer to a success they didn't even plan for. As a result, the whole EV transition happens like slicing a salami, where every single cut just slips one electronic part into a regular gas car. Software came first, sensors came next. Detroit did not always control the knife. Regulators, safety agencies, policy cut many of those slices for it. Every single cut added to the car's price tag. The first cut came from electronics. If you take apart a modern gasoline car today, you will find that behind the pistons and radiator sits an electronic architecture built to support radar, over-the-air updates, and cybersecurity long after the car leaves the dealer lot. Ford's FNV architecture is a clear example. Ford put it into high-profit vehicles like the F-150 and the 6th generation Bronco, giving gasoline vehicles broad over-the-air update capability. The car still burns gasoline, but the bill of materials starts to look like a computer. The buyer may not choose a pure electric vehicle, but the buyer still pays for the electronics, software, and architecture created by the same transition. Safety regulations delivered that second slice. Toyota began putting cameras, radar, lane systems, and automatic braking into vehicles that were once considered basic transportation. Other automakers followed because consumers, regulators, and safety ratings all moved in the same direction. A modern base Corolla is no longer basic in the old sense. Even a cheap Toyota now carries technology that not long ago would have sounded like a Lexus feature list. As driver assistance technology crept into internal combustion cars, it crushed whatever hope was left for a truly cheap car. As electric components and smart architectures are forced into old-school vehicle designs, the cost of the EV transition slowly gets baked into the gasoline car sticker price. The good news is, as these smart systems find their way into more and more cars, mass production will drive these costs way down in the future. However, batteries are still left out of this cost reduction. But there was still one problem for automakers. If plenty of disconnected, stripped-down, cheap gasoline cars were still sitting on dealer lots, who would buy the expensive ones? By a twist of fate, a local regulation from years ago accidentally solved this problem, effectively delivering the third slice of cost increases to gas cars. The American fuel rules had a massive loophole. The bigger the vehicle, the easier it was to pass the test. Detroit quickly realized it was much easier to just stretch a vehicle's wheelbase than to invest in a more efficient engine. Chrysler moved first. In 2016, it ended the Dodge Dart and Chrysler 200. The company kept leaning into Jeep, Ram, the Dodge Challenger, and larger vehicles that could carry bigger prices. In 2018, Ford executives crunched the numbers and faced a grim reality. Continuing to dump money into tech just to meet tightening fuel rules would push the price of a $15,000 Ford Focus close to $30,000. With razor-thin margins on cheap cars and Toyota aggressively eating into their market share, the math just didn't work. Shortly after, Ford pulled nearly all of its traditional passenger sedans out of the US market entirely. General Motors followed with its own exits. In 2022, when the US jacked up its fuel economy standards, Toyota immediately rolled out a complete redesign for its Sequoia SUV, which hadn't been updated in 14 years. To meet the new rules, Toyota delivered a humorous solution. They made the truck even bigger, stretching its length by nearly 3 inches. By expanding the car's size, Toyota made its fuel efficiency targets much easier to hit. The twist, of course, was that a law meant to save fuel produced a truck that was heavier, less aerodynamic, and offered a slight increase in real-world efficiency. And every time that happened, the average American buyer lost another low-price option. According to EPA data, SUVs and pickups, the light truck side of the market, now account for more than 60% of new light-duty vehicle production in the United States. This triggered an unexpected multi-car pileup. Cheap oil weakened the urgency for EVs. Lacking urgency stalled economies of scale. Lacking scale kept batteries expensive. Expensive batteries demanded even stricter fuel rules. Stricter rules pushed up the market share of big gas vehicles. Big gas vehicles squeezed out cheap small cars, clearing a price runway for EVs. Big gas vehicles generated fat profits to fund EV tech, and big gas vehicles burned through even more cheap oil. It was an unintentional 3 birds with 1 stone masterstroke. The survival of this loophole wasn't just a favor for Detroit. Instead, it emerged as a strategic equilibrium among 3 warring forces: legacy gas cars, rising EVs, and the US shale oil industry. While Detroit was merely an actor in this particular slice of the price hike, the extra profit wound up funding their salami slicing tactics anyway. By this point, Detroit had already cut software, sensors, safety systems, and computer architecture into the gasoline car. The 4th slice was the most important and the toughest one to pull off: the battery. Here is a fascinating story. In 2025, a sudden wildfire swept through California, trapping a blogger on a mountain escape route at 3 a.m. Creeping through a 4-hour life-or-death traffic jam, they had to blast the AC the entire time to maintain cabin pressure and force filter the smoke to prevent suffocation. A traditional gas car might have run dry idling for that long. Instead, that tiny 1.0 kilowatt-hour lithium battery in his newer car became the family's lifeline, with the engine kicking on for just 2 minutes whenever the juice ran low before shutting back off. Most of the time, of course, drivers don't even notice the battery is there. It doesn't deliver a single mile of pure electric range, nor does the car drive like an EV. Yet beneath the chassis, consumers are already footing the bill for pricey lithium. This slice only gets you the small batteries. When it comes to the big ones, Detroit has no desire to cut that salami itself. The mild hybrid Ford F-150 requires just a small 0.5 kilowatt-hour battery. The fully electric F-150 Lightning, by contrast, needs a giant battery pack of around 131 kilowatt-hours for range. That is a nearly 300-fold increase in capacity. Right now, batteries in the US are just too expensive, and the production capacity isn't there. Detroit is in no rush to slice this pie because they already know a deep-pocketed giant is out there, desperate enough for a breakthrough in power tech to come run over and foot the bill. Even Tesla will have to rely on them to slash costs and scale up production. Ford and its partners poured billions into battery projects like Blue Oval SK. Then, those expensive EVs just weren't selling fast enough to use up the batteries. Just as Ford was ready to throw in the towel, Silicon Valley showed up waving a checkbook. They scrambled for batteries, sending trucks to line up outside Ford's factories overnight. Then something happened that almost nobody saw coming. Watching the endless convoy, Ford executives dried their tears. They quietly abandoned their EV targets, letting Silicon Valley foot the bill for their battery learning curve. The smart play for Detroit is what we see today. They use big gas car profits to slice EV technology into regular cars bit by bit. They are waiting to take the final step to full EVs until AI titans and utility companies step in. These tech giants have the cash, and the more they pay for the clean energy shift, the cheaper cars get for the average buyer. The heavy price of battery upgrades and factory building was shifted from Detroit to Amazon and Microsoft, with grid energy storage taking the biggest slice. The battery cost drop Detroit couldn't pull off suddenly looked possible in someone else's hands. Industrial policy pushed the same story a fifth slice further. When automakers try to replace imported components with North American alternatives, the local parts can cost 25 to 50% more in some categories. Since late 2025, insurers were seeing more ordinary vehicles written off after moderate crashes because expensive imported parts and higher replacement costs could exceed the vehicle's remaining value. Prices for used parts have skyrocketed to an all-time high across wholesale platforms like Manheim. This matters beyond cars. If the automotive supply chain were to break, we can imagine a story of what might happen next. Boeing got a big surprise when trying to order specialized cutting tools for titanium alloy blades, only to hear, "Out of stock." Volkswagen halted production, so we shut down the line. Restarting those big furnaces takes massive orders that only car giants can provide, and the small orders from aerospace companies were not enough. Even waving cash couldn't cover the huge cost to run the factory. This simple story shows just how much other industries depend on the car business. And here is a blind spot you probably missed. Silicon Valley cares deeply about whether the supply chain breaks. The reason Silicon Valley cares is simple. Tesla keeps presenting Optimus as a future product, not just a laboratory curiosity. Rumors around Apple, OpenAI, and embodied artificial intelligence keep pointing toward machines that need batteries, motors, sensors, camera. Those are automotive supply chain skills, and in many of those areas, robots may demand even more than cars. If robots succeed, cars may stop looking like the final product and start looking like one branch of a broader machine-building system. So the car buyer is not only paying for today's vehicle, they are helping keep alive the industrial system that could build tomorrow's robots, drones, and machines. Those costs do not politely announce themselves on the window sticker. They just become a higher MSRP. Then there are the traditional costs that everyone already knows about. Labor is one of them. Then credit became expensive. These costs have nothing to do with Detroit's transition, but they hit cheap cars hardest. A buyer who can barely afford a new entry-level car is much more sensitive to another $1,000 than a buyer shopping for a large SUV. When skyrocketing labor and credit costs push new cars out of reach, buyers simply head to the used car lot. If overseas markets hadn't demanded EVs, the US market wouldn't have been in any rush to adopt them. At least that was the case for the past few decades. Now, with the sudden demand for drones, robots, or whatever new hardware is next, someone has to foot the bill for this supply chain transition. Heavy gas guzzlers' profit covered the initial R&D costs for EV hardware and software. Detroit, scraping by on razor-thin margins, had nothing left to pay the bill. Amazon and Microsoft paid for part of the battery tech upgrades. In fact, the price behind a $50,000 ordinary SUV is something most major electric vehicle nations have paid. Either way, somebody always pays.